Hey, in this video, we're going to be talking about the character of false teachers. We're going to be talking about what they look like, describing them, and this is kind of a follow-up to the previous video that we did where we talk about discernment and how to begin to identify a false teacher. In this video, we're not going to tell you how to identify them. We're just going to really describe what they look like. So let's get right to it. Hey, my name is Richard Swartz.
And I'm Jeremy Seifert.
And today we're going to be talking about the character of false teachers, what they look like, and just some characteristics and how to identify them. And we need that, especially in times like this where we have people that are just so many ministries, so many teachers, and so much noise that we need to filter out and begin to identify. But the Bible has a lot to say about these false teachers. It has a lot to say about what they look like, the things that they do, and things like that. And I think it's important before we get started is that normally we don't have a problem naming names when it comes to false teachers. Normally we have no problem putting a name out there or a ministry and calling alarm to it. But in this video, we're going to try to stay away from naming anyone in particular because we want you to be able to identify the characteristics that we're talking about in this video. Now, it's just for some grounds, some evidence, we can see in, I think it's 2 Timothy and in Titus, where Paul actually does name names of false teachers. So we have this stigma against naming names. Don't name names, touch my anointed, things like that. We don't subscribe to that view here on Scripture Matters. We are okay with naming names normally, but for the sake of this video and the exercise, we're going to stay away from naming names in this particular video. So, did you have anything you wanted to say before we get started?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, I think we're sort of staying away from that to, like you said, to prove a point, and we don't really want to limit any of the attributes we're going to be talking about here to specific groups of people or names or ministries that we might bring up. And so we're just not going to bring up anybody. Yeah. And that way it serves a more general purpose.
Absolutely. I agree. Well, the very first verse we're going to look at, it comes from Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. And I'm going to read it here. It says, a different gospel, not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. Mm-hmm. And that's some strong language. And so the first characteristic we want to go to is that they preach a different gospel. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important because, I mean, that's the kind of the bedrock of our faith. But we know that there are false teachers that are using they use the word gospel, and they have like a minimal gospel presentation or whatever. And so how do we just decide which one's is really preaching the gospel and which one's not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you started here in Galatians, because Galatians is a great example of one of the ways we can look at that. Galatians, the issue at the heart of Galatians was the group of men that were coming into the church and claiming that in order to be a true Christian, anyone coming in from outside the Jewish faith, anyone that was coming in through a Gentile background, had to get circumcised in addition to, the following and the repenting and believing. And they said, oh yeah, well, you also have to do this one thing. And so the interesting thing about Galatians is Paul is addressing, this heresy in the book, and he doesn't mention any other issues with their teaching. So presumably they were teaching that Jesus is God. They were teaching teachings in accordance with the Trinity. They had all the other boxes checked. They just had this one other thing hanging out there, and that one thing, just adding circumcision into the mix, was enough for Paul to say, "Oh, this is a completely different gospel."
Right.
And so I think we are in a postmodern age nowadays where we're so steeped in relative truth and subjective weighting of whether somebody's teaching this or that. And there's a lot of people out there that have really slick language. They're not very precise in their language, in
Hmm.
the theological statements that they make.
Hmm.
So it can be a real challenge to try and understand, is what came out of that guy's mouth in accordance with the gospel of Christ, or is it something different?
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect question is, and I think we can broaden it just a little bit here. Are they pointing people to Christ, or are they pointing people to something else
Sure.
as
Yeah.
well? So that's the first mark is they're going to teach a different gospel, and we have to understand the true gospel. I mean, it's kind of like a banker who's working with money that, they examine the true, and then anything that deviates from that, they can say, oh, well, that's not it. And so
I
we're,
love that analogy.
yeah, yeah. Let's see, I've got another verse here. Let me get this up here. So the next one is 2 Timothy 4:3. And it says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions." Now, this is a red flag. Now, this is talking about the people, not the teachers themselves. But what we have here is teachers that are teaching things that kind of gratify or satisfy or appeal to the flesh. And
Absolutely.
and this is where we get the health and wealth. That definitely falls in that category. The health and wealth and prosperity. They're saying things, lofty things, name it and claim it. They are saying things that appeal to the desire for worldly success, worldly materialism, things like that. And I would even say physical healing is one of the elements that they use to. And let's talk about that for a second, because I would, for those who've been watching my program, I'm sure you've seen I wear hearing aids in both ears. I've worn them for over 35 years, and so the prospect of physical healing is a very appealing thing to someone like me. I have gone to people who have said, "Well, healing is yours, and you just have to pray in faith." And then I walk away thinking, well, maybe I just didn't have enough faith. And then when you have that mindset and you teach people that the gospel is supposed to bring you healing now, but then you're going to be saved, and I don't have faith for healing now, then what about my faith to being saved? And so is that how this works? And it can be depressing. And
it can.
So the thing I would say here to someone who may be struggling with physical healing, or is that that's not what the gospel came to do. It is not about your immediate physical healing, and the key word there is immediate. The gospel did purchase healing for everyone, absolutely, but it doesn't mean that we are all going to be healed in this life, as we're walking in this earthly tent. And so that was another thing I wanted to say, is that on the I'm going to go back to the previous verse here for just a second, because a different gospel they distort. This also means that they can emphasize that let me see, that different truths of the gospel, that it
there you are.
Yeah, sorry. But they came to emphasize different truths. So yeah, maybe the gospel may cover something like healing, but they put an undue emphasis on it, and that can still steer you away from the truth. And so those are definitely something that false gospel. Let's go on to Titus 1:9.
I wanted to jump in there real quick,
okay,
because I think we talked about healing there as a pretty prime example of this, but it's not the only way. I mean, this appeal of to carnal aspects is not the only way that this presents itself. I think there's a lot of teachers that sand down the rough edges of the gospel too, and just they are either very overly inclusive, or they're very minimalistic of sin. And so just by removing the seriousness of sin, I think you can accomplish the same thing and appeal to people's itching ears,
Mhm.
because I can think of several people whose ministries are marked by a refusal to call sin sin.
Mhm.
And so people love going there because it feels so good. They get affirmed, they get positive language talked to them.
Yeah.
And there's a minimization of the fact that Jesus says you must deny yourself, take up your cross, your instrument of death, and crucify yourself every single day, the
Mhm.
flesh.
Mhm.
That removing that is a key aspect of what it means to be preaching a true gospel in a sanctifying sense.
Mhm. Well, we can distill that down. Basically, say if they're not talking about repentance, and if they're
Yep.
not talking about sin or
Mm-hmm.
holiness, your alarm bells should be going off.
True.
The true gospel. I mean, Paul, he emphasizes holiness, repentance, turning from sin,
Mm-hmm.
and so there is a teaching out there. It's called hyper grace, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
people just should not have any regard for their sin at all, and that is also a a perversion. So let's go on to Titus
Sure.
1:9. This is talking about teachers. It says he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the qualifications of a true teacher is that they have to be able to give sound doctrine and rebuke those who contradict it. So one of the characteristics of a true teacher is you have to be able to say that's false.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some ministries out there that won't even say that's false, or they won't even say, they dismiss it and say, well, I don't know, I'm not gonna say anything bad about that, I'm just gonna say my thing. And that right there means you're not operating as a true teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just say they don't provide any corrective instruction.
That's a good way to put it.
They don't provide corrective instruction. Let's look at the next verse here. 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patient teaching. Same thing. They have to be able to rebuke. They have to be able to have that corrective instruction, and without it, they're not serving their flock. They're not shepherding their flock.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so that kind of wraps up the first part where they just teach wrong doctrine and they don't correct false doctrine or anything like that. Now that's the false doctrine part. Then there's another part, which is the greed and worldliness. And so the first verse I have there for that is Titus 1:11. It says they must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not teach. And to me, when I think of greed, a whole bunch of ministries that I've seen pop up in my head, and we're gonna try not to name any of them, but these are just the super wealthy pastors and preachers, especially we see them on TV. And
Yep.
yeah, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think we have to be careful there because Jesus himself talks about not muzzling the ox that treads the grain, and and in context with making sure that those that are acting in service to you by being shepherds over you are compensated well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing really wrong with a pastor whose flock rewards him even beyond that. And so a wealthy pastor isn't necessarily a sign of a false teacher. However, the more wealthy in comparison to his congregation that he is, the more it should raise red flags.
Absolutely, I would agree. Wealth by itself is not the problem. It's the mindset and I would say the way the ship is sailing. And a good example would be a godly. Solomon and David. These were not poor people.
Yep, agreed.
And so just having lots of it is not. But what are they doing? Are they Are they promising you things? That's, to me, that's what where the red flag is. You do this, you sow your seed, and then God will give you more. The giving to get mentality, that is definitely, and that system works for those who are telling it to other people. It doesn't work for anybody else.
Yeah, when you're at the top of the Ponzi scheme, it's a good place to be. But yeah, the message a lot of times by these preachers, like you were getting at, their preaching is characterized by, you all should want wealth. You're all going to get wealth too. And that right there sort of seals the deal up. That kind of shows you where their heart is. And I can think of a video I saw a few years ago of a couple of pastors who had their congregation bring dollar bills up to the front, however many dollars, whatever. And they spread it all across the front of the stage, and they're all rolling around in it and shuffling up and dancing in it. And I'm just looking at that and I'm going, that's disgusting.
It is. It is. It's worldliness, and that's what where we're going with this. This is just worldliness. It is consumed with the things of the world. And as a Christian, we're pilgrims. We're passing through. We're not pitching our tent too deep here. And so, and wealth and the accumulation of all that kind of, we kind of live more permanently here than we would otherwise if we had that proper eternal perspective.
Totally agree.
So the next verse I have comes from Jude, and we need to look at this characteristic, and it says, "Yet in like manner these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious one." That one right there, I think, is a big one, especially in the American culture, because we're taught so much independence, and we carry that attitude into the church. And we don't like people telling us what to do. But that's the way God designed the church, is to have people in authority and to have people overseeing and elders and leading and shepherding the congregation. That's one reason right here that I reject the home church movement that has no church government or has no church structure, has no overseers. It's just kind of a party, or just kind of this, we'll just have one person lead, or there's no leaders, or anything, and they act like that's a spiritual thing. But this is a mark of someone who is a false teacher, is they reject authority. They're not accountable to anyone. Especially now, to apply it to the other end, where we have corporate church, so to speak. They have the CEO that model, where they just have one guy that's just like untouchable, and he has no authority over him. He is the authority. Well,
I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but I do think that I think a key here for us would be also, we have these members who have assembled their little pet teachings, and they have gone out rogue, and they have distance himself from churches, because churches have, maybe I know one person in particular who was trying to get something taught at a church, and the church wouldn't have any of that, and they wanted to be a teacher. The teachers, the teaching staff at the church, the ministers said no. They recognized it for what it was. That person left the church because they could not submit to the desires of the pastors to do this in the right manner and teach right things. They left. And I think that really too is the kind of thing where you should really be worried. Somebody is approaching things in a godly manner, and the other, from an authority perspective, and somebody else brings false teaching in. If they're unwilling to be teachable, and they're bent on continuing to do what they want to do in contradiction to that authority, that's a bad sign.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of, and we said we wouldn't name names, but I think we can name an ancient heretic that did this. Have you ever heard of Marcion?
Marcion?
Yeah. He wanted to rewrite the Bible. He took out the whole Old Testament. And how many Christians do that today? How many pastors are doing that today, where they just ignore the whole, they may not physically remove it out of the Bible, but they just won't reference it. And
Hmm.
that's the same kind of thing that we're talking about here. And what he did was is he went to the church and he actually corrected Paul's letters, and he revised the Gospels, took
Yeah.
out any reference to the Old Testament. And what happened? The church said, no, that's not what we do here. And so what does he do? He rejects the authority and he goes and he sets up his own church.
Yep. Great
That's, yeah,
example.
yeah. So they reject authority. And the next one is Romans 8:5. It says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Oh, it's just basic worldliness here. They're just living after the pursuit of physical happiness, material happiness, and things like that. And I want to say, and here's why it's important. If you are presenting the gospel and Jesus comes and says things like deny yourself, take up your cross, and we're going to someone and we have a prosperity message, then the gospel's not going to apply to the really wealthy. It's not going to apply to the politicians. It's not going to apply to musicians and movie stars and so forth, who are just raking. They have everything that they need.
Yep.
But that's the problem, is they're setting their minds on the flesh, not the things of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
So, okay. And 1 John 4:5, it says, they are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens to them. Yep. That's huge. They are worldly, and when they start speaking, they gather a worldly audience. And yes. Paul Washer said something that, what was the quote? If you have to use worldly means to attract converts, you're going to have to use worldly means to keep them. Something to that effect, yeah. Or carnal means.
Or
that's
it's
what.
often said, "What you win them with is what you," or what? Yeah, what you win them with is what you win them to.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And so they're winning people from the world. The world likes that message. You know, false teachers. You're either false teachers or teachers in general. True teachers too. You're either feeding the sheep or you're feeding the goats. And whichever one you're feeding, the other one is starving, because sheep don't like the food that the goats eat, and goats don't like the food that the sheep eat. So look at who they're drawing. If the world finds the message of the cross appeal, or or whatever message they're teaching appealing, that's an alarm. What kinds of people are listening to this stuff? Christianity is about denying yourself. All right. So let's see. 2 Peter 2:3 and 14. I'm going to kind of skip right down to the end. They have hearts trained in greed, and even Peter calls them accursed children. Accursed children. So, let's see what else we've got here. And then 1 Timothy 6:5, it says, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. And for the Christian, and the verse does say this, it is a means of great gain, but it's not the worldly gain that we gain. We're not promised wealth in this life. We're not promised of health. We're not promised all of these things, but yet that's what these prosperity preachers are promising. And
agreed.
It's off balance, and it's not directing people to the cross. It's not directing people to denial of self. It's not directing people to true godliness, and they just they're using it to get money, and they're not passing offering plates. They're passing offering buckets when at their meetings. So.
Agreed. Another thing to watch out for too is if it may not just be about money. There are I think there are other things that are benefits in this world that false teachers can accumulate for themselves. And so they could adopt something like a false humility, or a false or be an extremely ascetic lifestyle, where, and we see this in certain cult leaders, where they will like make an example for their followers of like renouncing all personal ownership, and so they gather this group around them, and they're marked by an extreme poverty, actually, but at the same time they have gathered a lot of power. Maybe it's power over the people that are under them or whatever. And so it's not just I want to broaden that a little bit and say, yes, absolutely, money is probably how we see this most often working out in the spheres that we travel in right now.
Mhm.
But that may not be the only sign, and it may not be true. I just want to caution anybody that's listening that a false teacher might not adopt an extreme piety in some form
Mhm.
as a way and renouncing some of these things and still be a false teacher.
Right. And where people get that from is the rich young ruler, where
Yeah.
go and sell all that you have and give to the poor, then you will have treasure in heaven. And sometimes we take that as a prescriptive means to holiness, but we're not commanded to sell everything we have. But yeah. So I don't have any more verses for this. There are verses that talk about it, but I don't have any more to bring to the show right now. But another mark of false teacher is scandal. Ministries that get caught up in scandal. And we know that no ministry, true and false ministry, true and false teachers, we know that no one is immune from scandal. But we're talking about what characterizes a ministry with scandal, and those are definitely people you want to avoid. Don't sit there and continue to feed. They go away for a little while, and then they come back, and after they've been caught in a scandal, and then they go back into another scandal, and I've fallen for this, where they say, oh well, I repent and I turn, and then David's the often used example, that David fell, but then he was restored, and then they go and they fall again, and it's just their characteristic of their ministry.
Yeah, I think it would be for people listening to this, pay attention when the Bible speaks in like some of the Pauline epistles and such for the qualifications of elders and things. And note what they're saying there about the beyond reproach, classifications and things like that. A lot of these pastors, it's not about the fact that they stumbled, because that can happen to any ministry. They can have the minister or someone associated with the ministry fall into grievous sin. It's how that ministry handles it. And if they minimize it and they whitewash it, and pretty soon you see this pastor restored to that place of power very shortly, or maybe they're prevented in that ministry, good for the ministry, and then they leave and they jump over to some other place and they immediately get a job at a church somewhere else or something. That's bad.
Yes,
that right there is a huge red flag to you. That there's immorality going on and it's not being dealt with. Whereas you can think of other times when scandals happen, where people are removed from ministry, they issue public apologies, they're working with their leadership and their pastors and the elders that are over them and whatever to take time away, to be with their families, to be away from that, and maybe even not come back. That's how we would want to see this handled, because sin can happen to any of us. So really, you should watch these ministries and see how the ministries deal with the scandal when it happens.
Right. Absolutely. Our response is very important when it comes to moral failings and things like, and even true teachers can have that. We want to acknowledge that, but we definitely want to stay away from those that are characterized by that. And just step back and look at the movement. Look at all the different strains, and I want to say, and I'm not boasting here, but I want to say that those in the Reformed camp are generally not characterized by that. But that doesn't mean we haven't had our faults either. But you go into some of the more extreme versions of contemporary, or I shouldn't say contemporary, but broad American evangelicalism, you're going to find lots of stuff there that's just, that's a sign that something is amiss. So I hope in this video we were able to describe what false teachers look like, and describe what things to look for, and the benefit that you get for evaluating these things is that you get more solid teaching. You grow. You're not constantly having to shift back and forth, and you grow. You become more solid and firm, and you can stand and you can stand on those things better, and you have a confidence that's in God, not in the failings of men. And I'm just gonna add one. I got one more, and I didn't plan to say this, but if a woman is teaching men, know right away you are looking at a false teacher. Absolutely.
Amen.
Bar none. There's no wiggle room on this one. If you see women teaching men, that is a false teacher. The Bible does not recognize that. The Bible does not recognize women in leadership and in authority over men, and it does not recognize female pastors. That is a man-made invention. It is false, and you need to. I really don't like stepping on toes, but I know there are some people out there that are listening to women as pastors and teachers over men, and we need to step away from that.
That was a good point. Yeah. It's a kind of a grenade to throw at the end of this message, but we can talk about that some other time.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
And this is a great time to mention, we're always looking for feedback and challenges. So if you want to challenge us on that, if you want to raise some questions, please let us know.
Absolutely. And you can find us on Facebook, and let us know in the comments, and let us know on Facebook. You can get in touch with us. We would definitely love to have this conversation with you. And I think that's it. I think that's all we got. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close out the show. And as always, Soli Deo Gloria.